Bienvenue sur le show de Maxime. Bien des gens m'ont demandé d'être plus actif sur YouTube, pas seulement sur Twitter et Facebook. Il faut du temps et de la préparation pour faire une émission comme celle-ci et je n'ai pas eu le temps avant l'élection. Maintenant que je ne suis plus député, je vais consacrer tout mon temps à la promotion du Parti populaire. Ce sera une émission régulière pour rester en contact avec tous les partisans du Parti populaire et avec tous ceux qui s'intéressent à la politique canadienne. J'essaierai d'avoir une émission chaque semaine. Je discuterai de l'actualité politique, j'interviewerai des personnes très intéressantes et bien sûr, je répondrai à vos questions. Suivez-nous sur la chaîne officielle YouTube du Parti populaire et n'hésitez pas à nous donner vos commentaires. Les gens me posent une question récemment. Ils me disent « Maxime, pourquoi tu ne fais pas la course au leadership du Parti conservateur une autre fois? » Eh bien, j'ai tourné la page. Je n'ai pas l'intention de me présenter à la chefferie du Parti conservateur du Canada. Je l'ai déjà dit, c'est un parti qui est intellectuellement et moralement corrompu. C'est un parti qui ne veut rien entendre des vraies idées de liberté, de responsabilité, d'équité et de respect. D'ailleurs, je suis resté avec le parti 15 mois après ma défaite de la dernière course au leadership pour essayer de convaincre l'establishment du Parti conservateur de prendre nos idées. Et ils ont dit non. Et comme vous savez, Andrew Scheer a transformé le Parti conservateur en un parti de centre-gauche. Il essayait de plaire à tout le monde. Il a laissé tomber vraiment les principes conservateurs. Et ça me fait rire un peu parce que Erin O'Toole a critiqué un peu Peter MacKay au début de la nouvelle course au leadership. Et il a dit, bien, avec M. MacKay, si M. MacKay devient chef, maintenant, on aura un Parti conservateur qui va ressembler au Parti libéral. Bien, c'est le cas actuellement. Le Parti conservateur et le Parti libéral, c'est la même chose. Le Parti conservateur n'a plus de conviction, n'a plus de principes. Ils font des sondages et des focus group pour savoir qu'est-ce qu'ils pensent. Contrairement à nous, au Parti populaire, on défend des idées claires et des principes clairs. C'est vrai, vous allez me dire, on a seulement eu 1,6 % du vote à la dernière élection, mais quand même, 300 000 personnes ont voté pour nous, ont voté pour les candidats du Parti populaire. Et ce n'est qu'un début. Il faut continuer à bâtir ce parti-là. Et j'ai vraiment tourné la page. Pour moi, le Parti conservateur et le Parti libéral, c'est du pareil au même. Et là, je me concentre avec vous à bâtir le Parti populaire et à être prêt pour la prochaine élection. Et si nous voulons que nos idées puissent gagner, bien, il faut en parler. Il faut en parler ouvertement, avec passion et avec conviction. Et c'est pourquoi nous avons décidé d'être actifs sur YouTube et sur les réseaux sociaux. Et il y a des grandes différences entre nous, les gens du Parti populaire, et les conservateurs. On regarde seulement les politiques. Si on pense aux subventions aux entreprises, on est le seul parti politique à Ottawa qui a dit qu'il faut abolir ces subventions aux entreprises-là. Regardez Bombardier. On est en train de démanteler Bombardier. Les payeurs de taxes canadiens et québécois ont mis des millions de dollars, sinon des milliards dans Bombardier. C'est nous qui avons assumé le risque et nous allons tout perdre. C'est pas sain de donner des subventions aux entreprises. Ce n'est pas juste, ce n'est pas équitable. La meilleure politique, c'est de baisser les taxes et les impôts de tous les entrepreneurs et faire en sorte qu'on ait une politique qui soit juste et équitable pour tous les entrepreneurs. Et c'est ce qu'on prône au Parti populaire. Contrairement au Parti conservateur, qui croit encore aux subventions aux entreprises. Ils veulent encore choisir les gagnants et les perdants. Nous, on veut faire en sorte d'économiser 5 milliards de dollars et de faire en sorte d'avoir un taux unique pour les entreprises à 10 %. Ça, c'est une politique qui est vraiment différente avec les conservateurs. Et je pourrais vous en nommer encore plusieurs. Le débat sur la péréquation. Nous sommes le seul parti qui veut mettre de l'avant ce débat-là avec une solution claire, faire en sorte qu'on ait une formule de péréquation renouvelée, moins généreuse, plus équitable, tant pour les provinces qui reçoivent de la formule de péréquation, qui reçoivent de l'argent de la péréquation, que les provinces qui en donnent. Donc, Andrew Scheer ne veut pas parler de ça, n'a pas le courage de parler de ça, et pourtant c'est important pour la prospérité de notre pays, mais aussi pour l'unité de notre pays. Vous savez ce qui se passe actuellement dans l'Ouest canadien. Les gens sont très désabusés, très déçus de la politique à Ottawa, et les conservateurs ne prennent pas position pour avoir une politique qui soit bonne et équitable pour l'ensemble des Canadiens. Je vous ai parlé de l'abolition des subventions aux entreprises. Je vous ai parlé de renouveler la formule de péréquation. Je pourrais vous parler de faire en sorte d'avoir un budget équilibré. On est le seul parti qui prône un budget équilibré, et ça en 2 ans. M. Scheer, qui est supposément d'être un conservateur, et le prochain chef, ça va être du pareil au même. Ils n'ont pas le courage de dire aux gens où ils vont couper pour atteindre l'équilibre budgétaire. Nous, on le dit, on va couper dans l'aide internationale. 5 milliards de dollars qu'on peut économiser, là. M. Trudeau est en Afrique en train de se promener actuellement pour acheter des votes avec notre argent pour avoir un siège au Conseil de sécurité de l'ONU, siège qui ne donne absolument rien. Vous savez que les autres pays, les grandes puissances ont un droit de veto. Le Canada, maintenant, dépense l'argent des Canadiens pour acheter ce siège-là, et M. Trudeau fait une tournée en Afrique actuellement. Nous, ce qu'on dit, rapatrions cet argent-là au Canada pour aider les Canadiens d'abord. Donc, on peut économiser 5 milliards de dollars là. On peut économiser 5 milliards de dollars, comme je l'ai dit tantôt, dans les subventions aux entreprises. On peut économiser 1 milliard de dollars en abolissant Radio-Canada. Donc, je vous invite à aller voir le programme du Parti populaire. C'est les grosses différences, et il y en a encore d'autres sur les changements climatiques. Nous sommes le seul parti politique qui disons non à l'urgence climatique. Et pour nous, le traité de Paris, l'accord de Paris, on ne signerait pas ça. On n'imposerait pas de réglementation aux entreprises. On n'imposerait pas de nouvelles taxes aux consommateurs canadiens, contrairement aux conservateurs et aux libéraux. Donc, je vous invite à aller voir le programme de notre parti. Et pour les conservateurs déçus, les conservateurs déçus qui croient à ces idées de liberté, de responsabilité, d'équité et de respect, venez avec nous au Parti populaire du Canada. Merci.
Hi everyone, today we're going to talk about deficit, debt, interest rate, and how the world economy is still fragile despite or perhaps because of a decade of stimulus policies by governments and central banks. I know this is not a very sexy topic for many people, but it could have a major impact on your life. We could soon experience another recession or a major financial crisis, perhaps worse than the one we had in 2008. If and when this happens, everyone will want to understand why and will be asking for solutions. So you should listen to this conversation if you want to know what is coming on the economy right now, on our economy. My guest today is Philip Cross. He is someone who knows the Canadian economy inside out. He worked for 36 years at Statistique Canada, including as Chief Economic Analyst. Since his retirement from Statistique Canada, he's even more busy writing research papers and articles for various organizations, including the Fraser Institute and the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He is a frequent commentator on the economy in the media. Today, I want to discuss with him 2 very interesting papers in particular. The first came out a few days ago. It's about how Canada's soaring debt puts our economy at risk. The other one came out in 2016, but is even more relevant today. It is about how monetary and fiscal policies have sown the seeds of the next crisis. Philip, welcome to my show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Maxime.
So I just want to start with your latest paper study that was published a couple of days ago about Canada's debt and deficit. The Trudeau government is saying that our national debt is under control, but what is the real situation?
Yeah. Well, the national debt, which includes the debt of all Canadians, is well over 300% of GDP. That's one of the highest in the world. Corporations, such as Bombardier, for example, hold the most amount of debt of any country in the world. Households in Canada hold the second highest amount of debt in the world. Only Denmark has more debt. So to say that debt is under control looks at government in isolation. Their government, especially federal government, is relatively low compared to some other countries. But you have to look at the overall debt level. After all of this debt, whether it's household or corporate or government, is all being financed with the same income stream, which is GDP. So if the Canadian economy should experience a recession, if our export earnings decline sharply, for example, we're going to have difficulty servicing all that debt, no matter how much of it is just government. We have to support a great deal of debt.
Yeah. So in your study, you're saying, and I think your research shows that it's about 300% of the GDP altogether when you add household, corporations, non-financial corporation, and governments, federal and provincial governments. So at 300%, it's one of the 300% of the GDP. It's one of the highest amount of debts in the G20 countries. And
that's right. And it's actually relatively easy to remember. The debt is almost equally spread between these different sectors. Corporations have the most debt, as I said, at 118% of GDP. Households are a little over 100%. Governments are a little under 100%, but an easy way to think of it is it's relatively evenly distributed across these three major sectors, and all sectors have contributed to this. It's not a matter of, this sector is out of balance. Canadians as a whole have gone into debt heavily. It's not that surprising. After all, for 10 years now, the Bank of Canada has been running a policy of very low interest rates. They've basically been telling people, go into debt. It's good for the economy, and nobody talks about the risks and the vulnerabilities this creates for Canadians.
So we are there right now because of the bad monetary and fiscal policies the last 10 years. So can you explain, because we had a recession in 2008, as you know, the financial crisis. And after that, not only the federal government, but also other governments with their central banks, they were very looking at very easy monetary policies and also fiscal policies. So do you think it's because of what happened in the past with all that spending? And usually we're supposed to spend only during a recession. Right. And after that, for the long term, you're supposed to have policies that will be good for private sector investment and more structural reform at the federal level or the national level. So do you think that what happened after the crisis in 2008, the financial crisis, and when you said in your paper that's the beginning of the next crisis, so that's why we are so, what is the negative impact of all these deficit and monetary stimulus?
Well, the negative impact is that we have tried to stimulate growth with these policies in the short term, but in fact, they didn't work. In fact, if you look at GDP growth per capita over the last 10 years, we've had the worst decade we've had since the 1930s. So in fact, we went into a debt. We brought forward a lot of spending through lower interest rates to create growth, and in fact, it didn't work. So what we ended up doing is we've taken on a great deal of debt. We've created very little income. We don't have a lot to show for this debt. And so we were much more vulnerable going into the next downturn because we have this overhang of debt and very low growth coming out of the last downturn. We didn't use this money well to strengthen our economy, to boost fundamental factors that drive growth in the long term, such as productivity, such as innovation. Instead, we've created a lot of bubbles in the housing market. We've created a lot of debt related to housing. We have created a lot of government debt. And as I say, we don't have a lot to show for it. It's not like we invested this in oil and gas or we invested this in government infrastructure. We mostly use this debt to buy groceries. That's never a good recipe in economics.
Oh my God. So what you're saying is right now the situation is worse than it was before the recession in 2008 because of all these debts and corporate households and governments. Right. So the solution that governments and central banks are using to stimulate the economy, at the end, it was not stimulating the economy. I think it is more sedative to the economy. So what do you think? What do you think will happen in because central banks right now, the interest rate is almost at 0%, 0%. So they don't have a lot of tools in their toolbox to react if we have a recession soon. What do you think will be the policy that the Bank of Canada and other central bank will use if we have a recession in a couple of months or years from now?
Well, the Bank of Canada is already talking about, as the global economy slows, the Bank of Canada has already raised the possibility that they'll cut interest rates yet again, which fails to acknowledge that, we have pursued this policy of low interest rates and then of a lower exchange rate. Remember, not too long ago, as recently as 2014, we were at parity with the US dollar. Yeah. The Bank of Canada encouraged a rapid devaluation to 75 cents, and we've basically been hovering around 75 cents since then. That was supposed to stimulate exports. Didn't happen. In fact, you can see the bank in its research is spending a lot of time trying to understand why didn't manufacturing exports respond to the lower dollar. It's one of a number of variables that is not behaving in the way that economists expected. We expected low unemployment rate, for example, to bid up inflation. It's called the Phillips curve. Yeah. That relationship has broken down over the last 10 years. We expected the lower exchange rate to boost exports. That didn't work. So we have, the economy is entering an era now, or a space where a lot of things are not behaving the way economists expected. So it's not surprising that some of the traditional stimulative policies didn't work. A lot of different relationships that economists count on to help control the economy have not worked well. In fact, the relationships have deteriorated in recent years. So it's a real problem for the profession and unfortunately for Canadians.
So do you think it is like a little bit what happened in Japan the last 30 years? The Japanese government was using stimulus, monetary stimulus and fiscal stimulus. I think they did 15 stimulus in the last 30 years, and they still have little growth in Japan. Do you think that will be the norm in Western countries, very low growth because of the bad policies?
I think there's some evidence for that. I think Europe increasingly is trapped in this slow growth like Japan. As I said, Canada has been, despite all this stimulus, we're posted the worst decade we've seen since the 1930s. The one exception to this has been the United States. The United States has put up some half-decent growth numbers. They've been able to break out of this. Most countries are stuck in the range of 1-2%. The US, the last few years, they've been able to put up 2 to 3%. And I think it's partly because they've been focusing on supply side, not just short-term stimulus to demand, but they've been trying to boost business investment, reduce regulations,
reduce taxes.
So with the supply side approach, they've been able to create a little more. On the other hand, they are still running very large government deficits of nearly $1 trillion. So the U.S. hasn't discovered a perfect model, but I think they're showing enough progress that other countries, I think, should be looking at them and saying, what is it they're doing right that we should be thinking about doing as well?
So, Philippe, if we can explain to our viewers, low interest rate, we're seeing artificially low interest rate right now. The real negative impact on that it's helping government because, they can borrow money and it's very cheap, but at the same time, it's not efficient. What they're doing with money, as you're saying in Canada, we are spending for the grocery and not to invest in infrastructure or things that will be there for the future and for future generations. But the negative impact of very artificially low interest rate, the distortion that is created in the economy. What kind of distortion? Because we don't promote saving doing that.
No, and because we don't promote savings, we end up limiting investment. There's a very close relationship between the amount of saving and the amount of investing in an economy. So one reason we've seen investment decline all throughout the major industrial nations is low interest rates. But low interest rates have other insidious effects too. It encourages us, for example, to overinvest in housing. Yeah. It encourages governments to think that, they can continue to spend and accumulate debt and there's no consequences. It encourages this broad trend to more debt in the economy that we started talking about at the beginning. But it creates other specific problems. For example, everybody understands that there's defined benefit pension plans have virtually disappeared in the private sector. Yeah. One reason they've disappeared is that because for companies, they're just too expensive. Pension plans require a real rate of return in the long term of 3, 4, 5%. Instead, the real rate of return is only 1%. Companies just look at that and go, no, we're going to close our pension plan. So in fact, we've ended up removing an important safety, part of the safety net for Canadians because of low interest rates. And yet we never talk about the negative impacts of low interest rates. We only talk about the supposed benefits of the stimulus.
And there's a lot of negative impacts, like you said, and also the malinvestment. The resources are not well used. Corporation can borrow money, but if they don't invest the money in new equipment or new way to be more productive, that won't help the economy at the end. That won't help that corporation at the end. So that may be another, like you just said, negative impact. The real way to create growth and wealth in our country is to promote productivities and promote real investment. So, but as you said, as a politician, I was a member of parliament for both. And if you don't give the right incentive to the government to do structural reforms, they won't do it. And right now we're looking at the federal government and some provincial government. They don't have any incentive because of these low interest rates to do structural reform like lowering taxes or flat tax on business or more free trade. The real reform that will create growth and wealth in this country. Do you think that the government will change their policies on growth and to be more realistic about the future? Because all these stimulus are not helping on the long term, and we need a structural reform and the tax reform and other kind of reform that will help to build the economy for the future.
Well, when you say the government, I think you mean the federal government. I don't think there's any sign there. They're getting the message. The good news is, though, that there are signs of progress at the provincial level in Canada. And given the very decentralized nature of our federation, what happens at the provinces is at least as, if not more important than at the federal level. For example, a lot of the government debt that we've accumulated has been at the provincial level. Very large deficits, especially here in Ontario, but also Alberta fell into large deficits. But there's sign, though, with the recent elections in Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec, that we're getting more governments that are more oriented to getting deficits under control, to bringing in structural reforms, reducing regulation and taxation. So I don't think everything's bleak on the policy front. I think even if I don't expect a lot of progress in the federal level, I think we're beginning to see some real progress at the provincial level. And I think it shows up, for example, in Quebec. I mean, Quebec has posted extremely good growth rates. Yeah. They're running consistently large deficits. The business sector, their biggest problem, if anything, is just finding more workers. There's a real shortage.
Well, you said the Quebec government, they're in surplus right now.
That's right.
Yeah. So yeah, okay. But they want to control, and they are controlling their deficit, and they want to control the debt, and that's important.
Yeah, and I think that actually there's been a consensus in Quebec going back to the 1998 Bouchard budget of generally running a surplus, except in the most extreme circumstances, like at the worst of the 2008-2009 recession. So I think there's a consensus on that in Quebec that we have to run surpluses and invest in the future. And hopefully we'll begin to see more and more of that type of thinking in provinces like Ontario and Alberta, which until recently have been running very large deficits.
And except at the federal level, because what I'm seeing from the Trudeau government and the finance minister is, for them, they're spending money right now. We're not in a recession. The deficit will be around $15 billion. And like you said, it is not working to create long-term...
Not only not working, I think there's a negative impact to the federal government running deficits, because it sends the message to Canadians that not only are there not risks in debt, but it's good for the economy somehow. So I think it's important that we focus on examples, especially like Quebec, where we see that we can have strong economic growth and budgetary surpluses, that sends the opposite message. It shows that deficits not only are not stimulative, but in fact may have a negative side to them. So if we can see the move towards these types of policies in Ontario and Alberta also begin to pay off, maybe that message will get through more broadly to Canadians that the wisdom, the supposed wisdom of the federal finances is in fact might even be a negative force in the economy.
If I look at our country, but if you look around the globe and other Western countries, do you see that there's a risk of a recession or a crash in the stock market? Because you are speaking about bubbles. I think there's a bubble in the stock market, maybe in the bond markets, and it's all about the money that the central banks are creating. And do you think that these bubbles are at risk right now?
Well, I think they certainly are at risk. I mean, history has shown, I've studied recessions all of my professional life, and one of the major conclusions that comes out of it is that when we're in the middle of a recession, we adopt policies that introduce distortions, especially into the financial and monetary system, that in the short term may actually alleviate the recession, but in the long term begin to create problems that eventually blow up into major problems. You can go back to 1975, and almost every recession has its origins in actions taken to fight the previous recession. So if you extrapolate that, in 2008, 2009, we undertook, in most major industrial nations, a really extreme experiment with, especially with monetary policy. In a lot of countries, negative interest rates, not just low interest rates, but actual negative interest rates, quantitative easing, large deficits. So we're carrying on quite the experiment here. The track record suggests that this is not going to end well. We're already, but you can't say, this year, next year it's going to end. But we do know we've introduced a lot of distortions. We're carrying on quite a risky experiment. The history of economics suggests that this will end in tears.
Usually when the central banks are creating money, fiat money, it has an impact on inflation. And right now, the inflation in Canada and in other countries, it is not so high. Is it because the definition of inflation is not the right one, or the way that we calculated inflation it's not the right way to do it? The central banks, they have an inflation target of 2%, and the inflation is very low. But it's supposed to be, if you look at Hayek and other economists, when the central bank is using quantitative easing or low interest rate, usually the inflation will go up. So what is your view on that?
Well, let's clarify what central banks have been up to. They haven't been creating fiat money. What they've been doing with quantitative easing is they've been buying bonds, they've been buying assets, and in the hope of, well, not just the hope, they have bid up the prices of assets, bonds, stocks. The Bank of Japan, for example, went right into the stock market and bought stocks. That's the most extreme example of quantitative easing. But central banks have been very aggressive in bidding up the price of assets. The hope was that we would make some people rich, and these rich people would then go out and spend money. Well, it didn't. We did increase inequality. We did create a lot of rich people. How unfortunately they didn't spend it. So what we have on the one hand is we created a lot of asset price inflation, but we didn't create inflation as measured by the conventional consumer price index. So that's something the Bank for International Settlements, for example, which is the central bank to central banks, they've been saying that our definition, the definition that central banks use for inflation is a little too limited. We have to broaden this away from more than just CPI. We should be incorporating some measures of asset price inflation. If you do that, then you would say, yes, we have created more inflation than conventionally measured by the CPI.
Okay, so the real inflation is higher than what the Bank of Canada is telling us, because they don't take into account the asset inflation and all that. So if you look at the global picture, we have inflation in this country right now, and in other countries.
Yes, and if you ask a young person, they will tell you, yeah, I can't get into the housing market, especially in Toronto and Vancouver. I can't buy stocks. I can't buy these various assets. They're simply too pricey for me. So we've created some intergenerational problems.
So I think the future is not looking so great. We may have a recession, and what will be the solution at the end? The central banks and government, because in your paper you're saying, they're looking at the short term, their stimulus. It was supposed to be good at the short term when we have a recession. I'm speaking about fiscal stimulus and monetary stimulus. But now it's not only on the short term. They are doing that for the last 10 years.
Right.
So what will be their reaction if we have a crisis from different governments? Do you think that they will have the right incentive to do structural monetary reform or structural budgetary or fiscal reform? What must be the real solution to all that?
Right. Well, I think the reflex of governments, as we've seen from how people are talking about confronting this most recent slowdown in the global economy, is the reflexive solution is let's go back to monetary and fiscal stimulus. Hopefully, though, smarter people will look at the longer term picture and say, no, this hasn't worked for 10 years. Let's stop doubling down on policies that have not been effective. And instead, let's look at those parts of the world where growth is better, such as the United States, such as Quebec. And what can we learn from these examples? And hopefully people will realize short-term stimulus, demand stimulus, it won't work. What we need to do is to focus more on the supply side of the economy, on adopting policies that will increase the productive side of the economy and then boost innovation in the long term. So there's a wide range of policies that would do this, for example, less regulation, less tax,
lower tax, personal tax.
Interprovincial trade barriers, for example, another one. So there's a wide range of things that we could do in the supply side that we haven't done for 10 years because we've been too focused on counting on short-term demand stimulus to work.
But do you think that if or when a recession will happen, people will say, that's a capitalist system that doesn't work, and we may have some socialist government? Do we have a risk to go further to more government control and central banking doing policies and action that are not in favor of the long-term growth?
That's a concern, and that was one reason why I wrote this paper in 2016 for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I was worried that if there is another downturn, that, you look at the rise of Bernie Sanders and people like that, and then there is an increasing criticism of capitalism. What I was trying to say in that 2016 paper is, no, what's gone wrong since 2008 is we've been conducting this, frankly, experiment with monetary and fiscal policy. And if this doesn't turn well, we shouldn't be blaming the capitalist system. We should be looking at these very risky and unproven policies we've adopted since 2008 and 2009 in the monetary and fiscal area, and we should be pointing the finger at that and saying, no, this not only did this not boost growth in the short term, which was the goal, but it increased our vulnerability in the longer term. And we should be pointing the finger directly at risky monetary and fiscal policies, not the capitalist system.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. It's easy for some politician to speak and say, this is not working, this is the capitalist system, but it is not that. The free market is always, I think, working if you let people alone to do what they want to do without interfering with bad policies. And now you have corporations that are, because the low interest rate are it's very easy for a corporation to borrow money. They are borrowing money, but they don't use that money efficiently. We call them zombie corporation. You said Bombardier and other corporation. So that's why I hope that the central bank will have the courage to increase interest rate in the near future. But if they're doing that, I've read in your paper that the bankruptcy rate is very high in our country, so that won't help. They're kind of a squeeze. They were trying that experiment for 10 years, and now they don't have any room to maneuver if something happened.
Yeah, the time to normalize interest rates is probably past. I mean, with the global economy slowing, it's going to be very difficult to get central banks, particularly the Bank of Canada, to raise interest rates in that environment. But that doesn't mean that we're out of bullets. It doesn't mean we can't. What the Bank of Canada should be doing, for example, is putting pressure on governments and saying, we will only keep interest rates low if you adopt things that improve the supply side. That might be a way out for everyone, give people an incentive to adopt better policies.
But I was surprised by the governor of the Bank of Canada a couple of months ago said to the government the opposite. He said, we did everything that we can do as a banker and a central banker. Now it's the government that must spend more money and more deficit. That was coming from our central bank. And he was arguing and asking the federal government to spend more money that we don't have. And instead of, like you just said, saying to the government, you have solutions to do some structural fiscal reforms and you must do it. I was very disappointed from the government saying that, first of all, is supposed to be independent from the government and from politicians. Mm-hmm. And, and he was boosting and promoting budget deficit in Ottawa.
Yeah. I think this governor has been, a very disappointing term. He was brought in to replace Mark Carney. Yeah. Mark Carney is, one of the leading voices for a dovish, very soft monetary policy. I think with the government, when they appointed politics to replace him, we're hoping for some change. But that just may reflect that, one person, not even a governor, can change the thinking of an institution. So there may just be that the forces for lax monetary policy, not just within the Bank of Canada, but within the whole monetary policy establishment throughout the industrial world, are so strong that it's going to be very difficult for one person to resist that. But all the more reason to continue for people to continue to point out that A, these policies didn't work, they failed, and B, that there are governments and situations in the world where the economy appears to be improving and they're not relying on short-term monetary stimulus. And hopefully, eventually, central banks will hear that voice. We've heard some other very important, renowned international economists raise questions about conventional economic thinking. I'm thinking of Lawrence Summers. I'm thinking of William White. The Bank for International Settlements has been very critical of central bank policies. And obviously, central banks have to hear that message. Hopefully, they will continue to hear it and they'll pay more and more attention to it. And we'll see better policies going forward.
But it's too bad that you're one of the only economists in Canada who's speaking about that and alerting other mainstream economists and the media. We don't have the discussion in the mainstream media. We don't have the discussion in Parliament. Both established political parties, the Liberal, the Conservative, are for deficit, and they didn't have the courage to speak the truth and telling people that, no, it's not going well. We need to do that. We need to tackle the deficit. We need to balance the budget. But it's great that you are having that position, and it's too bad that other economists, when we are listening to the news or reading the news, it's all about deficit. It's good, but it is not. And you show it in your paper with historical review of other countries.
And not just in the paper. I mean, I've also written some op-eds, which I encourage people to look at in the National Post, pointing out just how growth has failed over the last 10 years, how these policies haven't worked. Hopefully, as some of that message will get through because what concerns me most is what I don't want to happen is that the global economy goes into recession and that Canada then suffers the way a lot of countries suffered in 2008, 2009. And we learned the hard way that debt creates a lot of vulnerabilities. I think it would be much better if we learn voluntarily this lesson, because if we don't, I suspect we'll learn it the hard way.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for your work. And if our people want to read more and know more about your work, they can go to the MacDonald-Laurier Institute or Fraser Institute. I think under your name, there's a lot of your studies over there. And as you said, you are writing in the National Post on kind of a regular basis. So is there other places that they can find your work? Or?
I suppose on my website, Philip Cross Economics, that I have some centralized work there.
That's great. So I want to thank you very much for having that discussion with us. And the goal of that interview was to show to people that there's another side of the story that the main media are not covering about deficit and debts. And I think that, like you said in your paper, that's not the solution. We need to change. And I hope that people can understand that message. It's very important for the future of our country, but also not our country, because it's happening in other countries also. Monetary stimulus and fiscal stimulus. And we need to have real growth in our country. And I want to thank you for your work. It's helping me and our viewers to understand a little bit more the situation in our country. So thank you for taking your time, and thank you for being at my show.
Well, thank you for having me, Maxime.
Thank you, Philippe. I appreciate that.
All right.
Une situation très dangereuse se développe actuellement au Canada. Une petite minorité de manifestants bloquent des rues, des voies ferrées, des ports dans différentes régions de notre pays. Ils manifestent en appui au chef héréditaire Wet'suwet'en qui s'oppose à la construction d'un gazoduc sur le territoire qu'il revendique comme étant le leur en Colombie-Britannique. Si ces blocages se poursuivent, cela pourrait paralyser plusieurs secteurs qui dépendent de manière cruciale des transports. Pour les manifestants, il s'agit d'un conflit entre le colonialisme canadien et les droits des peuples autochtones. Mais ce n'est pas vrai. Le conflit divise en premier lieu les communautés des Premières Nations. Les 5 conseils de bande élus, Wet'suwet'en, en appuient. Ils appuient la construction d'un gazoduc. Leur communauté va en bénéficier. Il apportera des emplois et du développement économique. Seuls les chefs héréditaires s'y opposent. Ces chefs font peut-être partie d'un système traditionnel de gouvernance autochtone, mais c'est une façon réactionnaire de gouverner une communauté et une société qui date d'il y a des siècles. Nous ne pouvons pas lui donner une légitimité politique. Le conflit oppose aussi l'ensemble du Canada à une poignée de militants verts radicaux qui veulent nous ramener à une société pré-moderne et pré-industrielle. Ils veulent qu'on arrête d'exploiter nos ressources naturelles. Ils veulent que notre économie s'effondre parce qu'ils pensent que c'est ce qu'il faut pour sauver la planète. Le Canada est un pays moderne et démocratique, fondé sur la primauté du droit. Nous ne pouvons permettre à une infime minorité de fanatiques réactionnaires de paralyser notre économie. Ou bien nous pouvons dire au revoir à notre paix sociale et notre prospérité. Dans cette première édition du Cirque politique, je dois parler de la course à la chefferie du Parti conservateur. Il n'y a pas de meilleure illustration de la façon dont la politique au Canada est devenue superficielle et absurde. Eh bien, avez-vous vu le premier mime publié par Peter MacKay, le favori dans cette course? Regardons-le. Par contre, je dois avertir toute personne susceptible d'avoir une crise d'épilepsie, fermez-vous les yeux, ça peut être dangereux pour vous. Voilà donc la grande vision de Peter pour le Canada. Qu'en est-il de ses propositions politiques spécifiques? Eh bien, il pense que les défilés de la fierté sont importants et il marchera dans un défilé à Toronto. Ça semble être la question la plus importante à l'heure actuelle pour le Parti conservateur. En tant que chrétien pratiquant, Andrew Scheer ne voulait pas participer au défilé de la fierté. Les médias de gauche ont décidé que c'était inacceptable et que c'était une preuve de son intolérance. Quiconque ne croit pas ce qu'ils croient et ne fait pas ce qu'ils font est un raciste ou un intolérant. J'ai marché dans un défilé de la fierté il y a quelques années. Je n'ai pas l'intention de marcher à nouveau. Je n'ai rien à prouver et franchement, je me fiche de ce que diront les gauchistes. Un défilé est juste un défilé. Non, Peter, ce n'est pas important. Ce qui est important, c'est de veiller à ce que l'État traite tout le monde de la même manière et que chacun ait les mêmes droits. Vous n'avez pas besoin de marcher dans un défilé pour ça. Vous devez plutôt vous assurer de bien gouverner sur la base de principes clairs.
Mais la gauche politiquement correcte s'intéresse davantage aux symboles émotifs et s'en sert pour attaquer la droite. Et le Parti conservateur, intellectuellement et moralement corrompu, est trop faible pour riposter. Vous avez aimé? Abonnez-vous à notre chaîne YouTube, faites une contribution déductible d'impôt en cliquant sur le lien plus bas et n'hésitez pas à regarder d'autres vidéos. À bientôt!